Welcome back to the last episode of my Windigo deep dive. This episode moves us much closer to the present day, now discussing the effects of the obsession with the Wendigo in pop culture, as well as exploring some of those films, shows, books, and games. I again offer the disclaimer that I'm not, at least to my knowledge, of Native American or First Nation descent. I'm in no way trying to speak for or personally represent these groups or their beliefs. All of my sources can be found on the main site, and if I missed some information, you can email me at backawayslowlypodcast@gmail.com. We discussed the collision of Native and European experiences regarding the Wendigo. However, it's impossible to cover such a topic without acknowledging the attitudes and impacts surrounding that crisscrossing of cultural practices and beliefs. For example, Robert Brightman in his 1988 paper The Windigo in the Material World mentions Honigman, who remarked that much can be dismissed about the Wendigo, as often, quote, trustworthy observers are lacking. What he means by this is that not enough witnesses to a Wendigo are white. Brightman points out, quote, the lack of European observers does not discredit the existence of Wendigo cannibalism. Neither are there European eyewitnesses to the much more frequent occurrence of famine-induced cannibalism. The likelihood of a trader, missionary, or white trapper being in a position to observe such tragedies is minimal. Put simply, it was rare that a European was even around indigenous tribes often enough to potentially witness a Wendigo incident. And so, by only including European reports, we drastically diminish the information that we should be considering. By not having cultural knowledge of these tribes, the unfamiliar fur traders and missionaries could provide a testimony that's unbiased by those cultural beliefs. However, those outsiders were already influenced in how they viewed the native peoples. We've mentioned numerous times that missionaries almost always viewed descriptions of the Wendigo as the indigenous version of the devil, when the entire concept of the devil was never present in those communities, therefore wedging in an entirely irrelevant concept and incorrect belief to their own observations. These Euro-Canadian witnesses were, perhaps unintentionally, coloring their own view of the creature. In conclusion, if you're going to dismiss the native reports of these incidents for reasons such as cultural bias, you have to extend the same treatment to the majority white reporters as well. And frankly, the native reports are potentially even more valuable because of the information that cultural context contains. It's not a question of either party being unreliable, so much as just human, with their own histories, prejudices, and beliefs. And we have to account for that. But now we're going to look at the effects of various portrayals of the Wendigo in the present day. Callie Hunchman focuses on this in her paper Stolen Spirits, the Appropriation of the Wendigo Spirit in Horror Literature. What does the book Pet Sematary, the novella The Wendigo from 1910, and more have in common? All of them were written by non-native creators that, at least from what I can find, didn't consult any native peoples or context, and yet they used the Wendigo in their stories. As Hunchman puts it, quote, their stories are told by a white man, who learned about them from another white man, who in turn learned it from a long line of white men with little to no connection to the tribe. Hunchman goes on to explain that by severing any context from the Wendigo, it allows these Western authors to call upon elements of mystic spirituality that are usually associated with Native American themes, but with no strings attached so that they can mold it to serve whatever purpose they need within their story. But it goes even deeper than that. There are usually two purposes to include indigenous elements to a story. One is the romanticization of nature. By exaggerating the values of Native American beliefs in particular, Hunchman writes, quote, non-Indian people feel more American by identifying with Native ideas, but without acknowledging the results of this appropriation. While there's nothing wrong with feeling connected to nature, using indigenous culture as a shortcut to that connection, while ignoring the beliefs and practices involved, is a problem. The other common reason indigenous elements are included in stories are to function as a boogeyman. The majority of Native focus in Western beliefs has been on the savage versus civilized idea. Native peoples are savages until they conformed to Christian standards, and usually not even then. By including an unknown people with strange ways in a story, it adds a thrilling and frightening element to a plot. If we zoom out from the Wendigo to how indigenous cultures are treated by Western society at large, Native spirituality is romanticized into something extremely profitable. We've all seen how Native beliefs have been watered down for profit. Dream catchers, feathered headpieces, tattoos, and the thankfully mostly retired Halloween costumes. Making a story have indigenous elements without understanding those elements is a byway to suggest unknowable spirituality, with the result of making an entire people's a commodity, while still not giving them any of the benefits of that profit, nor even the consideration that maybe they don't want to be commodified. What these authors and creators didn't, and usually don't, realize is that by commodifying the Wendigo for profit, they're participating in the exact trap that the Wendigo cautions against: greed. By dragging the Wendigo into the obsession with capitalist greed, it creates an endless cycle of consumption. It ignores the values that Wendigo stories are made to guide people back to, such as community, balance, and a reflection on one's own psychological health. It creates an illusion that we're learning about and including Native culture. Involving bits of cherry-picked indigenous cultural elements gives the appearance that Native peoples are being embraced, but by those cultural elements having been warped and hollowed out, it actually contributes to the erasure of Native culture. More and more indigenous knowledge and context is being ignored, all while people in general believe that Native culture is being preserved. And look, all of this isn't meant as a lecture about why you should feel guilty for watching a show where a Wendigo pops up. Trust me, I've consumed many of the shows, books, and games that we'll discuss, all before I even picked up an academic book or paper on this topic. There are so many creative projects out there in all kinds of forms. There's nothing wrong with being curious about something you're unfamiliar with. But stories don't come from nowhere, and if I've learned anything while running this show, it's that stories and monsters mean everything to the community they're from. This is true across the world, be it Bigfoot, the Chupacabra, Mothman, the Kappa, the Luguru, you name it. These stories and monsters become part of a cultural identity that's important to acknowledge. And hopefully this show and its sources will help make learning about this history and these communities more accessible. I encourage us to be curious, be entertained, but also consume these stories with your brain turned on and with an open mind. Alright, with that being said, let's look at the Wendigo in pop culture. The Wendigo's been around for so long and become so popular that some people have decided to utilize pop culture in order to teach and preserve culture in the modern day. One of these people is Professor Brady DeSanti, who reminds his students that most mainstream pop culture Wendigo stories are created by non-Indigenous creators. Because of this, it should be kept in mind that these sources shouldn't be blindly accepted as an accurate representation. However, he's found ways to utilize these books, films, video games, comics, and more that contain a Wendigo to learn more about the truth behind the modern uses. He actually reviewed some of the films and shows that we'll discuss today, so I'll reference his papers as we go along. But I took note of his academic papers, and it pushed me to view these forms of pop culture that I've consumed for so many years, now with a critical eye. I still enjoy the stories that are more inaccurate, but I'm now aware of what and where their shortcomings are. We'll be taking a look at several examples, but as there are so many, I've decided to only focus on the iterations that I know well or had time to review. I'll say a few things about these shorter entries before I move on to the more in-depth reviews. Charmed is a TV series about 3 witches who are sisters, and Season 1, Episode 12 is titled The Windigo, which aired in February of 1999. One of the witches of this group is turned into a Wendigo after being attacked by one. A transformation like this is already much more similar to a werewolf than a Wendigo. Professor DeSanti is also quick to point out that the visuals of this Wendigo are much closer to that of a werewolf. The creature's very hairy, having an instinct to scratch and bite, complete with claws and fangs. Quote, and, in the most obvious reference to the werewolf, a person infected by the Wendigo only turns into one during a full moon. One interesting detail that they do get right is that the original Wendigo's heart had turned to ice and had to be burned to destroy the creature permanently. This is a detail that's almost never included in pop culture, so I want to acknowledge that Charmed included it. However, despite this, there's no context given to how this creature came to be. In fact, there seems to be no native representation or background given at all. It's just another monster of the week. Season 1, Episode 19 of the TV series X-Files is called Shapes. It follows Mulder and Scully as they visit a reservation to investigate a native's death. A cannibalistic spirit invades a rancher's son who then eats his father's flesh. This is already an improvement to Charmed, as the main characters are walking into the setting and world of indigenous peoples, instead of taking the creature's legend and molding it outside of this community. However, this episode calls this creature the Manitou, which they describe as an evil spirit. Manitou is actually Algonquian for mysterious being or mystery, other sources diving into the spiritual belief system of countless individual spirits. Perhaps they hoped that calling the spirit something other than a Wendigo would allow for more flexibility? I'm not really sure. The paper Cannibalism and Contact Narratives and the Evolution of the Wendigo by Michelle Leitz reads, quote, this reductive yet convenient appropriation abolishes all nuance and sacredness of the Manitou by depicting it as one specific evil spirit. What remains of the Wendigo in representation, the hunger for human flesh, association with darkness, physical transformation of a human into a beast, are merely the sensational aspects of the Wendigo, conveniently used interchangeably with the Manitou as a whole. Leitz also mentions that the Wendigo's key concept of greed is left out of this rendition, which is also true of Charmed. Let's turn to the 1983 book Pet Sematary by Stephen King. I know people love Stephen King, and by all means, please enjoy his books if that's your preference. But we have to talk about the misconceptions, errors, and stereotypes perpetuated in this book. We'll start with the most obvious. The 80s were a time when horror books and films loved to use Indian burial grounds as an easy source for any and all hauntings. Doing this perpetuates that native peoples have an unearthly ability. It attaches things, such as curses and death, to the remains of a specific people, which, in turn, creates an air of mystery and fear directed towards that community. It can mean that people don't respect that cultural group because they deserve respect and it's the right thing to do, but more so out of fear and self-preservation. I'll move on, but I really recommend taking a listen to episode 36 of the podcast Dead Meat, titled Indian Burial Grounds. I'll talk a bit more about it later, but it's really enlightening. Anyway, Stephen King's Wendigo has ram's horns, is able to turn people into a Wendigo with a touch, as well as the ability to resurrect animals. Kaylee Hunchman summarizes the largest issues of King's Wendigo better than I can in her paper Stolen Spirits. Quote, King's version of the Wendigo, while physically and partially behaviorally similar to the traditional Cree depictions of the supernatural Wendigo, does not fully represent the holistic idea of the Wendigo. King's version is tailored to dehumanize the Wendigo, making it an inhuman monster in a novel about the loss of humanity after death. Depicting the Wendigo as a supernatural monster targeting white people in Maine misrepresents the purpose and existence of the Wendigo, as it is no longer representative of the native environmental and cultural struggles it stems from. Instead, it is a depiction of the wild and animalistic stereotype of Native Americans often used by Western writers to instill fear and distrust in their readers. King has the Micmac tribe, who are doing legal battle with the US government for the ownership of their lands. Joe Nazare points out, quote, "Again, one sees how Native Americans are rendered a present absence in Pet Sematary, lurking menacingly offstage. It's the Native Americans' culture that supply the story with its plot, yet they are given no agency or representation within the book, except for the deceased patient Pascal, who warns Creed away from the Micmac territory." The pattern of burial grounds in King's stories echoes a familiar note with many of that time: the moral turmoil of white guilt. The YouTube channel Cracked had a show called After Hours for a few years. The videos are only a few minutes long, but the episode 4 Creepy Hidden Truths Behind Popular Scary Stories made an interesting suggestion that stuck with me. In summary, different areas of the world have their horror movies set in various places depending on their own culture's source of guilt. An example that they mention is that England's scary stories mostly take place in an urban setting. They argue that this is because it's where England's greatest crimes happened, such as the toils of the Industrial Revolution, using children, orphans or otherwise, as labor, parents thrown into debtor's prison, rampant disease and injury due to little understood and frankly unsafe machinery and practices. Now, over in America, a good amount of our horror stories and movies that are actually scary have taken place out in nature, be it a cabin in the woods, a secluded campground, or what have you. A lot of America's worst crimes took place on the outskirts of society, such as the erasure of indigenous people, killing them on or ejecting them from their own land, or kidnapping people from their homelands and enslaving them in order to build America. The native burial ground fulfills this theory, reminding us that we, as a society, were the worst thing that happened to those communities. The fallout of those acts, such as hauntings, can be viewed as the well-deserved revenge for the trauma that this country inflicted. I could talk about this video and its implications forever, but I recommend you go take a look for it yourself, and we'll move on. One final interesting detail was again from Nazare. He notes that the family's cat is named Church, and yet it comes back Wendigo possessed. The implication is that the Native American beliefs have wrestled with and won against Christian ideals. I'm not sure if this was the intent, but it's an interesting concept to consider. On to the next. The film Wendigo from 2001 follows a family of 3: George, a professional photographer, his wife Kim, and their 10-year-old son Miles, as they travel from New York to give George a break from his job at an advertising agency. They take this trip in the winter, which is a detail not often included: the winter weather and the isolation that it can enforce. On their trip, an indigenous shopkeeper tells Miles about the Wendigo, that it can change its appearance at will. I wonder if this is an attempt to capture an element of the Wendigo belief, the fear that anyone can go Wendigo. Since there are 5 or more ways to turn into a Wendigo in indigenous belief, the threat that anyone around you could become one was or is very real in Algonquian-speaking culture. A shape-shifting ability may be a shortcut, albeit a potentially inaccurate one, to try to capture that "it could be any one of you" suspicion. The shopkeeper gives Miles a small deer-headed Wendigo figurine, further contributing to the more native appearance of the Wendigo in modern pop culture. What's interesting is that Professor Brady DeSanti suggests that perhaps this shopkeeper is himself the Wendigo, masquerading as a normal man. He points out that no one else seems to see this shopkeeper other than Miles himself, suggesting this was an encounter meant only for Miles. This aligns well to our discussion that some spirits, particularly Wendigo spirits, can attempt to mislead or manipulate people via dreams, or in this case, an encounter in disguise. Quote, "The movie Wendigo accurately touches on some Ojibwe beliefs, such as the Wendigo's immense size, inability to metamorphose, and spiritual forces' occasional use of entrapment to cause harm. And while the native man from the store does not directly reference the Wendigo's cannibalistic nature, he does say that it is angry and possesses a voracious appetite in general, allowing for the possibility that the consumption of human flesh is involved in some way too." While Miles and George are sledding, a local named Otis shoots George, leaving Miles to go for help as darkness begins to fall. During his journey in the woods, Miles is pursued by a creature with a deer's head and a man's body. This may contribute to the Wendigo utilizing isolation, particularly in winter, being lost and afraid, to stalk and/or manipulate its prey. The movie continues, but I don't currently have much else to discuss for that movie, so we'll move on. One of the more recent TV shows that conjures up a very noticeable visual of the Wendigo is the 2013 TV series Hannibal. Will Graham is trying to help the police catch the copycat killer, as he has in-depth insights to criminal acts. The audience is shown the visual manifestation that Graham has of this murderer, the Stag Man. This is an entirely black figure, looking human in anatomy except for the antlers sprouting from its head. Although the figure is called the Stag Man, the imagery instantaneously elicits thoughts of the Wendigo. Considering how Hannibal Lecter is known primarily for cannibalism, this visual reference is no accident. However, the Stag Man offers no other context to the story, other than a cheeky, if not obvious, allusion to Hannibal himself. There's no discussion of the Wendigo or native reference, just a small nod to the Wendigo's main concept. Now for the more in-depth reviews. We'll start with Algernon Blackwood's book, published in 1910, The Wendigo. Born in 1869 to a religious middle-class family, it wasn't long before Blackwood began to show an interest in the paranormal. When he did begin writing, he preferred to stay within the genre of ghost stories. He moved to Canada for a time, and in October of 1898, he went on a trip with a friend to Quebec. Many argue, including his friend, John Prince, that this trip stuck in his head, eventually inspiring him to write The Wendigo years later. I'll walk with you through the broad strokes of the story, but just in case, here's a spoiler alert for a book that's over a century old. Dr. Cathcart, his guide Hank, the doctor's nephew named Simpson, Simpson's guide Defago, and the cook Punk make up the hunting party that's trotting through the Canadian wilderness. In the last week of October, just north of Rat Portage, now known as the city Kenora of Ontario, Canada, they've had no luck, so Guide Hank suggests that they go to a specific area. Guide Defago seems unsettled by this proposal. Hank begins to harass Defago, telling the others that Defago is scared of, quote, some old fairy tale. The next morning, they separate into two groups, each made up of a hunter and a guide, the cook staying at the main camp. Our perspective follows Simpson, a young student on his first trip into the wilderness. Simpson describes the beauty of the Canadian forests in great detail, appreciating the natural majesty that cities haven't touched yet. However, these descriptions take on an apprehensive tone. He realizes that without his guide, he'd be truly lost. This total reliance on Defago makes Simpson uneasy. The unease increases to concern as Defago begins to behave erratically, staring into the bush. When Simpson tries to question Defago, Defago says, quote, "It must have been just that song of mine that did it. It's the song they sing in lumber camps and godforsaken places like that, when they've skeered the Wendigos somewhere around, doing a bit of swift traveling." Naturally, when queried further, Defago dismisses the Wendigo as superstition, volunteering no more information. Simpson is woken in the tent that night by the sound of Defago sobbing. Simpson eventually determines that Defago's been crying in his sleep, but he also notices that Defago had shifted down in his makeshift bed, almost like something had been dragging him out. Simpson wakes again because Defago has sat up in bed, cowering against Simpson and away from something near the door flaps of the tent. In an unnatural silence, Simpson hears a roar near the tent, seeming to contain three separate voices. That voice calls out, "Defago." This proves too much for Defago, who bolts into the night. Simpson is unsuccessful in finding him that night, though he does catch the scent of decay. Simpson manages to find Defago's trail the next day, but he sees the footprints of something with hooves walking next to Defago's tracks. The hooved prints are much longer in stride than a man's. As Simpson walks on, he notices that Defago's strides are starting to lengthen to match the tracks of this mystery creature. Unfortunately, Simpson finds no answers as both of the tracks disappear, almost as if Defago was lifted into the air by the creature. Defeated and exhausted, Simpson makes his way back to the main camp. After he makes it to camp and recounts these mysterious events, Dr. Cathcart, Hank, and Simpson go back to try to find Defago. When Dr. Cathcart hears of his nephew's experiences, he predictably concludes that this entire sequence of events was merely due to, quote, illness, bewilderment, and terror, and that the unknown footprints were from a moose. Hank isn't so sure. He shares a criminally small amount of information about the Wendigo with them. Quote, for he admitted that a story ran over all this section of country to the effect that several Indians had, quote, seen the Wendigo along the shores of 50 Island Water in the fall of last year. When an Indian goes crazy, it's always put that he's seen the Wendigo. The Wendigo is said to burn his feet, owing to the friction apparently caused by its tremendous velocity, till they drop off and new ones form exactly like its own. This last quote seems to be an interesting attempt to inject some science into the speed at which a Wendigo can travel, but it's rocky at best. Hank goes on to say that the Wendigo will jump or run along the tops of trees, occasionally carrying a person with them before dropping them, much like a bird of prey may drop an animal to kill and eat it. Most bafflingly, he calls the Wendigo a moss eater. I went digging to try to see if moss eater was a euphemism or meant something different in the early 1900s, but I couldn't find anything, leaving my only conclusion to be literal. As they sit at the fire discussing this, they begin to hear Defago's voice. Something crashes down from the treetops, and it is indeed Defago. Or is it? His movements are jerky, like he's being puppeteered, his voice hoarse and wheezy. Hank immediately proclaims that this is not his friend of 20 years. This is something else. Hank and Cathcart draw attention to Defago's feet and lower legs, which are disfigured and twisted. A roar echoes across the surface of the lake, and Defago disappears. The group returns to the home camp to find that their cook is gone. However, they encounter a frail Defago shifting the ashes of the fire. He's changed from the night before, and Hank believes that this person is truly his friend. Defago can't remember anything, his face showing no facial expression. Quote, he did not seem to know who it was that embraced him, or who it was that fed, warmed, and spoke to him the words of comfort and relief. Forlorn and broken beyond all reach of human aid, the little man did meekly as he was bidden. He pulls moss from his cheeks, which confirms my interpretation of moss eater being literal. He can't keep down any normal food, and his feet burned like fire, but Dr. Cathcart finds his feet to actually be horribly frozen. He only lives a few more weeks after this expedition. When they find what became of their cook, Punk, they discover that he'd been cleaning fish by the lake when he saw Defago approaching. However, Punk could smell the scent of decay and recognized that something was terribly wrong. Punk had dropped everything and fled, never turning back. What's kind of funny is that this story left me in a baffling position, because I really like how Blackwood wrote. He's got some good suspense, and his descriptions of nature are beautiful, clearly demonstrating Blackwood's personal appreciation for the Canadian wilderness. However, I've rarely come across a piece of media so inaccurate to the creature it attempts to utilize, as well as being quite racially charged. Blackwood's writing definitely speaks to the attitude of the times. The hunting party's cook, Punk, is an indigenous person, though it's not noted which tribe he's from. We're used to films where the one native character is used to explain the creature and then vanish from the movie. Punk doesn't even get that courtesy. I don't believe he ever speaks a word, And at the beginning of the story, one of the guides is going to explain the Wendigo, but he realizes Punk is listening, so he changes the subject. The situation was poised and ready for the indigenous man to be a part of the description and context of the creature, to become an active element of the plot, and it's passed by entirely. I don't know how many different ways an author can describe a character as being dirty and smelly, but Blackwood describes all of them to Punk with no clear reason other than racism. Hank addresses Punk to approach the fire by telling him to warm his, quote, dirty red skin. When Punk gets up in the middle of the night, Blackwood describes this by saying Punk creeps from his, quote, odorous blankets. I'm not including everything here, but it's a ridiculous amount of unnecessary comments. However, Joe Nazare in his text, The Horror, makes an interesting observation. Blackwood may be quietly equating the Wendigo monster to the indigenous Punk. He spends paragraphs describing the smell of the Wendigo, an unnameable stench where the closest description is that of a lion's musk or the scent of decay. The most extensive description of Punk that we get isn't of his personality, his dress, or belongings. He's most frequently described by an odorous smell. Doing this creates an undercurrent of even further distrust of the native by the group, suggesting that a monster is hiding out in these woods, but that the native people are no better. At the end of the story, there are parallels about how quickly the Wendigo and Punk can travel. Punk is described as having made a 3-day journey at a rapid pace that, quote, only Indian blood could have covered. Nazare writes of this, quote, the terror of a whole race, though, seems to belong more to Blackwood, whose subtly demonizing rhetoric transforms the Wendigo from a native myth into a descriptive template for the Indian savage. Blackwood also perpetuates common stereotypes such as savagery to Punk. Other than Punk's smell and filthiness, Blackwood includes quotes such as, quote, but an hour later, when all slept like the dead, old Punk crept from his blankets and went down to the shore of the lake like a shadow, silently, as only Indian blood can move. The thick darkness rendered sight of small avail, but, like the animals, he possessed other senses that darkness could not mute. Then, merging his figure into the surrounding blackness in a way that only wild men and animals understand, he turned, still moving like a shadow, and went stealthily back to his lean-to and his bed. This fits into our conversation about ascribing native peoples to being almost inhuman due to their connection with nature. It doesn't speak of skills that Punk earned that allows him to stalk the woods, so much as attributing them to Punk being more animal than human. Blackwood also writes, quote, Punk had in him still the instincts of his dying race. His taciturn silence and his endurance survived, also his superstition. Even in the early 1900s, we see the attitude of Europeans, who believed that the native people were not long for the modern world. According to the perception of these Europeans, it was only a matter of time before the indigenous population disappeared entirely. The end of the story also describes the indigenous Punk as a spineless, self-serving member of the party, who'd rather abandon the rest of the group than try to assist them. Punk literally gets no say in anything, and serves only as a foil to make the other characters seem morally and socially superior. Let's move on to the titular creature, a creature that we bizarrely never even see. All we get is an impression of something at the edge of the tent, and a voice calling to Defago. When I compare the various descriptions of the creature and its abilities from indigenous belief held up against Blackwood's story, the only accuracy I can find is that Blackwood's Wendigo moves incredibly fast, and it's possibly very large. The list of inaccuracies is embarrassing and frankly irritating to read. Blackwood's novella is baffling because he spends so much time describing the solitude and isolation of the setting. With how much he writes about it, and how much apprehension some characters have of being alone, that as I read it, I thought that he must know about isolation's ability to create a Wendigo. But alas, from beginning to end, there is no indigenous context to be found. But by far, the most egregious error is that the Wendigo is never described as eating human flesh, or flesh at all. I'm so utterly confused at how Blackwood botched the main attribute of the Wendigo that makes it a monster. And not just that, but Blackwood goes one step further to saying the Wendigo eats moss? This almost feels like some kind of joke. And such a persistent emphasis on the burning feet. Blackwood seems to believe the worst thing about the Wendigo spirit is that it would run someone ragged overnight, potentially exhausting them to death. It seems that Blackwood's Wendigo is one in name alone. The story reads more like an Appalachian folktale than anything else. I tried looking around at other people's interpretations, just in case I was reading the story wrong, but I found nothing. It concerns me that other creatives in the future almost certainly looked at this novella, using it as a reference to inform their own creations of the Wendigo, instead of looking into indigenous culture. In particular, this story is the first place I've seen the use of a voice calling out to victims, or throwing its voice. So I wonder if this was one of the elements that wound down the grapevine to the modern-day pop culture iterations. But enough about Blackwood. Let's continue on to more modern renditions of the Wendigo. Okay, so I love Supernatural. Couldn't tell you how many times I've seen the first couple of seasons, and I'm currently making my way through the series at large. That being said, we need to talk about Episode 2. So again, spoilers for Season 1, Episode 2, Wendigo. The basis for Season 1 of the show is that brothers Sam and Dean are looking for their father as they hunt down monsters and ghosts across the country. In Episode 2, they end up in Colorado, and encounter a sister and brother whose other brother went camping and didn't come home. As they look for clues as to what this creature is, they track down a now elderly man whose family had been attacked and killed when he was a boy. The show claims that the creature returns every 23 years, hibernating in the meantime. There's really no connection to the Wendigo belief with this, it just seems to be an added area of tension for narrative purposes. Anyways, while the attack's official report says that the creature was a grizzly bear, the man says that whatever it was opened the door and moved incredibly fast. It killed his parents and left him with a jagged, clawed scar across his chest. The brother and sister from earlier have decided to go looking for their brother in the woods, with the assistance of a hunter, so Sam and Dean join them. The group finds the missing boy's tent bloody and torn. Sam draws Dean aside, opening their father's journal, which serves as a kind of monster encyclopedia. Sam opens the journal to a specific page, one where the name Windigo is written.
Oh, come on. Wendigos are in the Minnesota woods or northern Michigan. I've never even heard of one this far west.
I was a little surprised by this, as so many pop culture media forums will just put a Wendigo wherever they want one. In the very least, Supernatural mentions that it's weird that a Wendigo is here, that it's far outside its normal territory. Sam points out that the Wendigo mimics a human voice, which, as we've discussed, doesn't seem to be sourced in indigenous belief. Now, the show didn't have much of a budget this early on. With this in mind, I think that by leaning on an audible element of the creature, it could supply a cheap way to build tension. A camera guy calling from the bushes is a whole lot cheaper than the visual effects that would be needed to make this monster appear impressive and terrifying. Dean holds up his gun.
Well, then this is useless.
This is also accurate to many beliefs of the Wendigo, that conventional weapons are unable to kill one. Here's where the show takes an odd left turn. The group hunkers down for the night, and the brothers draw Anasazi symbols in the dirt around their camp as protection, claiming that a Wendigo can't cross them. This was weird to me even on my first watch of the series. The Anasazi, also known as the ancestral Puebloans, reside in southeastern Utah, northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, and southwestern Colorado. Although this episode does take place in Colorado, this tribe would have been hundreds of miles away from any tribe that had Wendigo beliefs. Why would symbols drawn by an entirely separate tribe have any effect on a Wendigo that resides in another part of the country? I can only hope that this isn't a case of all native cultures are basically the same, but I'm not sure. On that note, I started to think about the first season of Supernatural in general, and I realized that there are a few hints to imply that the show's use of native creatures, along with the events of the episodes, got a little mixed up. The coordinates that the boys are following to track down their father lead them to Colorado in this episode. However, if you look at the coordinates, they actually reside somewhere in Arizona, which is where episode 6 is located. This is significant because episode 6's monster is a shapeshifter. Between the Wendigo episode and the shapeshifter episode, and that they mention skinwalkers a few times, it makes me think that some stuff was shuffled around in production, and that this might be an example of the Wendigo skinwalker werewolf triangle that we see in pop culture, where one is mistaken for, combined, or interchanged with another. After all, skinwalkers are monsters belonging to the Navajo Nation, who reside in the same area where the Anasazi live. This tangled web isn't something that the average viewer is going to notice, I just tend to dig a little deep out of curiosity. In any case, Sam and Dean are forced to tell their companions about the Wendigo.
Wendigo is a Cree Indian word. It means evil that devours.
They're hundreds of years old. Each one was once a man, sometimes an Indian, or other times a frontiersman or a miner or a hunter.
How's a man turn into one of those things?
Well, it's always the same. During some harsh winter, a guy finds himself starving, cut off from supplies or help. Becomes a cannibal to survive, eating other members of his tribe or camp.
Cultures all over the world believe that eating human flesh gives a person certain abilities, speed, strength, and mortality.
But here's where we deviate again.
More than anything, a Wendigo knows how to last long winters without food. It hibernates for years at a time. When it's awake, it keeps its victims alive. It stores them so it can feed whenever it wants.
This seems to be a new conclusion reached by the show writers to explain the years between incidents, as well as to add an element of hibernation undergone by animals during the winter. I think it's an interesting idea, but when I think about the Wendigo we've discussed, I highly doubt a creature entirely focused on consumption would be able to stock provisions and make food last. While the Wendigo of some of the indigenous stories that we read does plot and plan in order to obtain food, we never once saw a Wendigo conserve food. When asked how they can kill it, Dean says,
Well, guns are useless, so are knives. Basically, we gotta torch the sucker.
While this is accurate to the Wendigo lore, they don't discuss any context for why this is. There's no explanation of the Wendigo's frozen heart. I suppose this may have sounded odd, as the search party walks through the moderate-weathered Colorado woods in relatively light gear. But that's the problem with changing the setting for this creature. There's no bitter cold, there's no lack of resources, and no real explanation for why the creature's been moved here. The hunter that they're traveling with ends up dead by a snapped neck, but not consumed in any way. Indeed, he's not even taken to serve as the Wendigo's supposed hibernation stash. This makes the hunter seem like a pointless kill, flying in the face of the priorities of the Wendigo creature. They eventually find the Wendigo's lair in a mine shaft. We'll talk more about how perfect the setting of a mine is for a creature like the Wendigo, but it's not really focused on in this short TV episode. When we see the creature, it's not very clearly. The mineshaft setting allows the production the benefit of darkness, so they didn't have to spend a lot of money on the Wendigo's appearance. What we do manage to see is a gray-skinned, tall, lanky, hairless creature, its skin stretched over bone. Michelle Litz writes, quote, with a rodent-like face and pointy ears that make it look more like the vampire Nosferatu than a traditional Wendigo. Who the Wendigo was while still human, before becoming a monster, is never explained within the episode, but the young boy's casual mention of the Donner Party has led fans to theorize that the Wendigo in this episode was once a member of that party. This is an interesting theory, as the Donner Party did travel through Colorado, but the expedition didn't really reach a point of desperation until Nevada, which was over 2 months after the group was in Colorado. Dean manages to kill the creature with the shot of a flare gun. However, they fumbled the bag at the last minute in terms of accuracy, the shot going into the creature's stomach and not the heart. This episode of Supernatural succumbs to the most common flaw when it comes to indigenous inspiration in pop culture written by non-indigenous creators. The story and creature belong to an indigenous group, but that community is kept firmly off stage. No context for the creature is given, and viewers leave the episode with no greater understanding of the creature other than a scary concept. The film Ravenous from 1999 starts with a very fitting quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. Quote, "He that fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." Second Lieutenant John Boyd is at a dinner in his honor, receiving accolades for his actions in the Mexican-American War. The camera is particularly careful to film these high-ranking military members digging into the food with an animalistic zeal. But Boyd doesn't join this frenzy. He stares into nothingness, or rather, back into the war. The congratulations echo hollowly as he sees the dead bodies he made or witnessed. The praise of the day congratulating him for this murder. The officers surrounding him take no notice, devouring whatever's placed in front of them. For anyone that's studied Wendigos, this is a very obvious allusion to mindless greed and consumption, be it of the food on their table or of the land they've come to conquer. This military force can take, so they do. They want it, so it's theirs. It's as simple as that. Boyd is interesting as well, as it seems clear that he's resistant to the blind patriotism that the others so eagerly embrace. DeSanti writes of this, quote, "His conflict over the ethics of that war and his reluctance to wholeheartedly embrace the rampant colonization of North America presents Boyd as the film's moral compass." Despite being congratulated for his service, Boyd is being sent to Fort Spencer in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, an extremely isolated military outpost. When Boyd arrives at the fort and makes introductions, some of this group includes Native American brother and sister George and Martha. We aren't really sure what tribe they're a part of, as they're only described as they, quote, "came with the place." We eventually find out that the source of Boyd's guilt lies in the fact that he played dead in order to survive a skirmish, being placed on a wagon of actually dead men. But then his own dead officers were placed on top of him. One could make the argument that his survival by the means of their deaths is another version of cannibalism. Only through the other's deaths do you survive, the self over the support of the group. Much like starvation cannibalism, this doesn't mean that Boyd's instinct to survive in battle is unreasonable or difficult to understand, but it might make Boyd potentially more susceptible to a Wendigo spirit. While Boyd is pinned under his deceased officers' bodies, their blood ran down into his mouth. Unable to escape the crush of corpses and needing to keep his cover, Boyd chokes on the lifeblood of his fellows. This again may make him more susceptible to the Wendigo, in accordance with the belief that those who have practiced cannibalism may be influenced to do so again. Boyd's been at the fort a while when a man stumbles into camp. His name is Calhoun, and he says he's been in the wilderness for 3 months. When questioned, he says,
"I said no food. I didn't say there was nothing to eat."
He goes on to recount a story that's very similar to that of the Donner Party, as his group of 6 was forced to winter in a cave. They started with the animals, then the leather in their clothes. Then they tried to find roots. One person eventually died from malnourishment, and, well... Calhoun says that he came back from foraging, and the rest of the group were cooking up the man's legs for dinner. Calhoun ate as little of the meat as he could, but he says that others were far more eager.
The meat did not last us a week, and we were soon hungry again, only this time our hunger was different. More severe. Savage.
They killed 2 of the men, leaving only their guide Ives, Mrs. McCready, and Calhoun. Seeing the writing on the wall, Calhoun fled the situation. Colonel Hart decides that the fort men will go find Mrs. McCready, as she may still be alive. But before the party can leave, George, the Native American brother, walks up to Hart and Boyd, unrolling a skinned pelt. George gestures at the illustration on the pelt, saying Wendigo.
Windigo, tanu liunil mushka lolishke, It's an old Indian myth from the north.
Windigo, muskaki ilo, tanu, temlu.
A man eats another's flesh. It's usually an enemy.
Tanu I uri tanu, tungamu, khagi.
And he steals his strength, in essence, his spirit. And his hunger becomes craven, insatiable. And the more he eats, the more he wants to. And the more he eats, the stronger he becomes. Georgia, people don't still do that, do they? White man eats the body of Jesus Christ every Sunday.
One of their comrades is injured in a fall on their journey. That night, he wakes up screaming, saying that Calhoun was licking his bloody wound. When they turn to Calhoun, he shakily explains that he was having a nightmare and woke up with his lips on the man's injury. He asks to be restrained, mirroring the stories of natives who believe they're going Wendigo, who request to be restrained or killed. When the group finds the cave, Calhoun begins to fight their approach, begging not to get closer. The group continues to the cave anyway, keeping weapons on hand. From what they'd heard from Calhoun's story, they're prepared to possibly encounter a cannibalistic guide and a traumatized Mrs. McCready, but no one answers the rescue party's cries. Boyd and an aggressive member of their party named Reich enter the cave. They don't find anyone, but they do stumble upon a dark hole to another, deeper cave. Climbing inside, they find skeletons, which were formerly Calhoun's party. However, these aren't simply bones on the floor. They're assembled in their full skeletons, hanging from the ceiling, and there are more skeletons than they expected. This is a trap. Meanwhile, Calhoun kills everyone outside of the cave, leaving Reich and Boyd being the only men left able to pursue. As they give chase, Calhoun mimics the voices of their dying comrades. At the edge of a cliff, Calhoun throws a knife at Reich, hitting his mark. Reich tumbles over the edge, leaving only Boyd and Calhoun. Boyd throws a knife at Calhoun, which does make solid contact, but Calhoun bounces right back up, telling us that average weapons are useless. Staring at what now he knows as a monster, seemingly unable to be killed, Boyd decides that his fate is best left in the hands of gravity, and launches himself off the cliff. By the end of his fall, Boyd sustained a broken leg, potentially more internally, and is now stuck in a hole with the wide-eyed, smiling corpse of Reich. You can see where this is going. Boyd eventually fights his way back to the fort. He heads directly to Martha and George's shelter, looking for George's illustrated pelt. Martha interrupts his search, and he begs her about how to stop this transformation.
How do you stop it?
You don't. You ever give yourself? Wendigo eats. Must eat more. He never enough. He takes. Never gives. You stop Wendigo. You give yourself. You must die.
This directly counters his previously selfish survival needs, that he must give in order to stop the ultimate evil. Understand that the word selfish is relative in this situation. Despite this being potentially untrue depending on the specific tribe, this key information comes from an indigenous person in this story, even though she and her brother aren't really utilized in any other way or given substantial personalities. Reinforcements come to investigate the incident at the fort. They claim they find nothing in the cave, or a trace of anyone in general. The colonel in charge, who already doesn't like Boyd, dismisses the Wendigo as a campfire story. They bring in a Colonel Ives to replace Colonel Hart, but it's a far too familiar face that walks through the door. Later, Colonel Ives, or rather Calhoun, swaggers into the courtyard to taunt Boyd. He decides to tell Boyd his villain backstory. At one point, Calhoun was suffering from tuberculosis and depression, sent off to a sanatorium to die. In transit, a native scout told him a curious story, that if a man ate the flesh of another man, he could steal the other man's strength and spirit. Naturally, Colquhoun just had to try, starting with the native scout. He discovered that the story was true, and he grew far stronger than he'd been as a normal man. Later, his wagon train got lost in the Rockies, after which he would consume 5 men in 3 months. He felt healthier than he'd ever been, and happier to boot. And this is why Colquhoun was confused. He's embraced this selfish way of life, and he doesn't understand why Boyd is rejecting it. DeSantis' paper observes, quote, "The man, Colquhoun, lacks any sort of moral compass in pursuing his bloodlust. Boyd can be viewed as exemplifying the moral dilemma that such actions pose to some immigrants, including those soldiers who, like him, fought in the war against Mexico." After this confrontation, Martha goes into the barn to find the horses killed and decapitated, their heads hanging about the barn. She and Knox find a man named Cleves, murdered on the roof, his body draining blood over the window. They immediately believe Boyd is guilty and imprison him. However, Colonel Hart is revealed to still be alive, and it's he who's responsible for the horrific scene with the horses. It turns out that Colquhoun decided to create his own friend, and, after committing such a reprehensible act, Hart seems powerless but to follow Colquhoun. This is when it's revealed that they intend to bring Boyd into their little group. The movie then goes full force into the symbolism of the Wendigo by utilizing the historic context of manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. Westward expansion. Come April, it'll all start again. Thousands of gold-hungry Americans will travel over those mountains on their way to new lives, passing right through here. We won't kill indiscriminately. No, selectively. Good God. We don't want to break up families.
You'll get caught.
Well, if it's just the 2 of us. Of course, with no wish to recruit everyone, we've enough mouths to feed as it is. We just need a home. And this country is seeking to be whole, stretching out its arms and consuming all it can. And we merely follow.
This is an interesting interpretation of the Wendigo. Clearly, these 2 Wendigos are self-involved, but aren't beneath teamwork to obtain their goals. This does slightly clash with the belief that Wendigos that encounter each other will fight to the death and consume the loser. However, there are a few indigenous stories where there are rare pairs of murderous Wendigos, usually father and son. When Boyd rejects their proposal, Colquhoun stabs him in the gut. Colquhoun's purposefully created a wound that will kill Boyd unless he consumes human flesh. With no other choice, Boyd acquiesces to the request. Later, Hart reveals to Boyd that he's overcome with guilt about the whole situation. Unwilling to live with what he's already done, let alone what Colquhoun's asking him to do, Hart asks Boyd to kill him. Boyd cuts Hart's neck, which by all general beliefs of the Wendigo and what we've seen earlier in this movie shouldn't work. But it does. An extended fight erupts between Colquhoun and Boyd, with extensive injuries given by both. This fight in general mirrors some of the stories that we took a look at, where sometimes it takes a Wendigo to kill a Wendigo, but there's no kind villager or loving grandparent holding a kettle of hot tallow to help cure Boyd of being a monster. Eventually, Colquhoun and Boyd are both ensnared in an alarmingly enormous bear trap. Colquhoun dies first, and though Martha sees this occur through the door, she leaves Boyd to his fate, fleeing the fort entirely. All in all, Ravenous actually had a surprisingly accurate depiction of the Wendigo. Native representation could have been better, and there were occasional errors such as a simple throat slice killing a Wendigo. But in general, I think they captured the selfishness of Colquhoun as well as the broad symbolism of the Wendigo. I was pleasantly surprised that they slipped in Manifest Destiny, peddled as a great dream of America's younger years, instead used as a trap for the naively idealistic. Not a bad interpretation for a movie from 1999. let's look at a different medium. How about a video game? Until Dawn is a 2015 game that follows a classic setup: a group of teens in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. We're going to go a little out of order of game events, since the game is about 80% interactions with and relations between this group of teens, as well as their responses to various circumstances. So let's start at the earliest events that can be found in the game's lore. Within the game, the Wendigo originated from the Cree, who lived on the fictional Blackwood Mountain from the 1400s to the 1850s. The Cree specifically didn't hunt on this mountain, as they believed it to be sacred, but the incoming European explorers and miners had no such qualms. In 1893, the miners excavated the mountain for tin and radium. However, the miners dug too deep and released the spirit of the Wendigo. I know this trope is popular. The first thing I think of is the Balrog from The Lord of the Rings. But I haven't seen anything in the indigenous beliefs that imply that a Wendigo is ever sealed underground, or how that would even be possible. In the winter of 1951 to 1952, the Blasting Crew group established mining operations, but a cave-in trapped 30 miners, which, of course, led to multiple cases of murder and cannibalism. There were only 12 survivors, all of which showed unusual physical characteristics. Cue the cover-up, and let's send those survivors to the Blackwood Sanatorium for some research. Naturally, the staff experimented on these men, until they were men no longer, and took their revenge. Now we jump forward to the events of the game's story, which takes place in the then modern day of 2015. After a prank gone wrong at the vacation house they're staying in, the characters call it a prank, I call it outright bullying, two sisters end up falling off of the edge of a cliff. The next year, the friend group returns to the mountain to hang out and honor their missing, or dead, friends. A whole lot of tense teenager hijinks ensues, but eventually they realize that Wendigos are chasing them. Now, this game has a very decision-based program. Because of this, any number of people can survive or die, and the story gets askew the more you go down each path. Because of this, I'll just go through the information that the game gives us about the Wendigo and how they portray it. The main source of information about the Wendigo comes from the Stranger's Journal. The Stranger is a man the group encounters who seems to be trying to keep the Wendigos under control and contained, which isn't going very well. His journal entry about them starts with, what else? Cannibalism. He describes the insatiable hunger, the isolation of the mountain, and its fierce winter storms. The journal does a good job emphasizing just how far this seclusion and starvation pushes a person, and that it makes them susceptible to a Wendigo spirit, which isn't commonly mentioned in other forms of Wendigo pop culture. Once turned, the person kills without remorse or even recognition, including his own companions. Quote, "He will eat the flesh raw from the corpses. I've seen this happen, for many years ago, a craving for flesh that cannot be sated. And then the change begins. The eyes turn first and become milky and white. Then the teeth become longer, like fangs. The creature grows, and the skin is pulled taut across the bones." Some of these visual details are specific in ways I don't often see with other descriptions of the Wendigo, but I think they're reasonably within the general range of Wendigo features from indigenous accounts. One interesting addition to the Wendigo lore of the game is that they give the Wendigo the Jurassic Park T-Rex's motion-based vision. Quote, "The Wendigo's eyes change. They become both sharper and more dim. The Wendigo sees movement. It is a hunter, like a hawk, but it cannot see stillness. If you are to keep totally still, then the Wendigo will not be able to see you." I have no doubt that this is a way to add tension-building gameplay into the story, as they lean on it for quick-time events. The same journal entry is accurate about the durability of the Wendigo, though it again introduces its own twist. The reason it's more durable is that the skin has hardened like armor, making it unable to be cut or stabbed. The game has also justified why the Wendigo can mimic voices. Quote, "Because the Wendigo is mutated from a human, it knows how to hunt us. It can perfectly mimic its prey." while I'm unsure if this is true or not, it's definitely an interesting idea. When it comes to killing one, the journal entry says that flamethrowers are best, though it doesn't mention anything about the frozen heart, or in fact, any other reason as to why fire is effective. It bafflingly reads that the fire will burn away their skin that they just said was as hard as armor. Anyways, the game makes a bit of an odd turn by telling the player not to kill Wendigos, as it'll release the Wendigo spirit, free to find another host. The stranger has instead been trapping them in cages in the old sanatorium. Yeah, keeping potentially immortal cannibalistic creatures all together in a crumbling building in the middle of nowhere sounds like a fantastic ticking time bomb, if nothing else. In another entry, the stranger says that he copied the rituals written down by ambiguous shamans, including the creation of artifacts. Again, I didn't find much about what physical materials would ward away Wendigos, but it gives the players something to collect within the game. The game dismisses any potential hints at werewolf lore by saying outright in one of the journal entries that bites do not turn you into a Wendigo, only consuming human flesh does. In terms of visual portrayal, the Wendigos look like humans, just deteriorated and warped. The muscles seem to have all but vanished, the skin turned white from a lack of sun exposure, and stretched over the bones, their spine curled inward. We eventually see a feature on one of these Wendigos, a tattoo. This tattoo is recognized by one of the characters, identifying the Wendigo as Hannah, one of the sisters. As it turns out, Beth had indeed been killed by the fall off of the cliff. Hannah, injured and trapped in a sunken mine, well, yeah. In any case, starvation and the transformation have made her almost unrecognizable, but the tattoo remains. The features that make the Wendigos appear truly monstrous are the fang-like teeth and claws. However, overall, including the loss of hair, the Wendigos look mostly like starving people. So while the game adjusted some factors for gameplay's sake, it's certainly not the most egregiously flawed when it comes to depictions of the Wendigo. Our last pop culture piece that we'll cover is the most recent, and probably the most controversial, or at least the most discussed. Antlers, from 2021. The film begins with this text, quote, "Mother Earth has been pillaged, stripped of her life's blood, a violation that has awakened the malevolent spirit, seeking the lost, the frail, and the depraved. Pray it desires, not you." In remote Cispus Falls, Central Oregon, 7-year-old Aiden Weaver accompanies his father, Frank Weaver, to an inactive mine, where Frank runs a lovely little meth lab. While Aiden waits outside, Frank and his accomplice hear a strange screeching from deeper in the mine. Trying to investigate, they find small bags hanging from the ceiling in the dark. They're beset upon by an unseen monster, the accomplice's gun having no effect on it. Later on, we see 12-year-old Lucas Weaver in class learning about the purposes of storytelling. His teacher, Julia Meadows, informs the students that storytelling in Oregon started with the indigenous people. This is a nice nod to the indigenous people, but we'll never really learn about their specific tribes, culture, or their stories. On the way home, Lucas kills a skunk and takes it home, a pattern that'll be repeated throughout the movie. At home, he sleeps across from a locked door as something bangs on the other side. The next day, Lucas is asked to share a story he's written. The story is disturbing, telling how there were 3 bears, but that father and baby bear had changed. They became meaner because they had no food, their insides turning black. We see a good number of deviations in this film compared to the short story it was based on, The Quiet Boy, by Nick and Tosca. One of these changes is that Lucas's story is of 3 wolves, not bears. In this wolf story, Lucas is worried that little wolf is getting rabies, which reminded me of our first episode on this topic. The belief that anyone or anything can go Wendigo had prompted me to question that some of these incidents were perhaps unrecognized cases of rabies, so clearly I'm not alone in that theory. After a confrontation with a bully, Lucas is given an exam where it becomes very clear that he's severely malnourished. The doctors try to call Lucas's home to reach his father, but there's no answer. Julia, already concerned from Lucas's story in school, tries to determine what's going on in Lucas's home. We see Lucas prepare a bloody meal, delivering it in a styrofoam package to the attic beyond the locked door. Lucas's father, Frank, races forward, more animal than man, and snatches the food away. He retreats back into the dark, and Lucas's younger brother Aiden comes forward. Aiden seems to be more lucid, but Lucas doesn't get much time with him, being forced to retreat when Frank begins to act up. Julia brings Lucas up to her brother Paul, who's in a leadership position in the town's police force. Paul is unsurprised she's had no luck with Frank, as he says he expects Frank to turn up dead with a needle in his arm any day now. Meanwhile, Lucas sits in front of the shaking locked door. His younger brother's voice starts to come through, begging for food. The poor kid puts headphones over his ears, implying that this is a nightly torture that he endures. Julia goes through Lucas's desk at school, finding a book about setting traps and snares, as well as the book Dangerous Spirits by Sean Smallman. I paused the movie at this point to get a clear look at the cover, recognizing it as I'd tried to find it as research for these episodes. It's a real book, covering primarily the Wendigo. I have no idea why the characters don't read this book or collect information from it later on in the movie, since it was practically gift-wrapped for them, but I digress. Paul tells Julia that half of a man's dead body was found partially buried in the woods, the other half found in the mine by a meth lab, so it's definitely the body of Frank's accomplice. The police are chalking it up to a bear or a cougar, but no one's convinced. When Lucas is visiting Aiden again, we see a glowing light emitting from Frank's ribcage. Lucas tries to feed Aiden normal food, but this causes Aiden to bleed from his eyes and vomit blood. Most indigenous folklore describes the Wendigo person as resisting normal food. This seems to be a more insistent take on this, pushing the food to outright harm the Wendigo. School principal Ellen goes to the Weaver house to track down Frank. She finds the locked door and, lured by the sound of Aiden on the other side, goes up to the attic. Frank appears and throws her across the room, eventually biting out her throat and tearing part of her face with his teeth. A human kill accomplished and flesh consumed, Frank undergoes the start of a horrifying transformation. Antlers begin to burst from his mouth as we cut away. In the mine, we see Indigenous actor Graham Greene's character explaining to Paul that the bags hanging from the ceiling are medicine bags meant to act as wards. They also find an antler on the floor. Again, I found nothing in my research to say that there's a physical thing or collection of objects that can ward off a Wendigo, but perhaps that knowledge lays with spiritual leaders of the communities and hasn't been widely shared. On the way home from school, Lucas is accosted by his bully, who is then killed by the now monstrous form of Frank. Lucas finds the house covered in bloody hand and footprints, revealing the path of Frank and Aiden's escape. The police go to the Weaver's house and discover multiple bodies in the attic, including that of the principal. But some of the bodies aren't really torn apart. No. It looks like something's burst out of their very bones. Through a memory, it's revealed that Frank came home from the mines knowing something was wrong, but having no one in town to turn to due to his reputation. It turns out that Frank had installed the locks on the attic door himself. Before locking himself in the attic, he told the boys not to open it, no matter what. Eventually, Aiden visually began to succumb to the same condition, so his father quarantined him up in the attic as well. It's here that Paul and Julia have the stereotypical meeting with Warren, Graham Greene's character. They show him Lucas's drawings. Warren asks if the student was a native. When Julia tells him no, he's confused, as no average child would know what that monster is or looks like. Warren pulls out the antler they'd found in the mine, as well as an old book. He flips the tome open to a page that has an antlered figure on it.
It's the Windigo. Translates to a diabolical wickedness that devours mankind. According to legend, during a brutally cold winter, A lost hunter's severe hunger drove him to cannibalism. And after feasting on human flesh, he became crazed and transformed into an amorphous spirit that could take many forms and roam the forest for fresh victims. His insatiable appetite was never satisfied.
Excuse me, this is a myth you're talking about.
Well, for you, yeah. But a cautionary tale to the indigenous people who believe in it.
I wish they would have let him go into the context behind the cautionary tale, because it's incredibly relevant for this town. There's a reason mines are such a good location for Wendigo stories. Remember what I mentioned about the Balrog from The Lord of the Rings? The description about it is particularly applicable here. I haven't found anything to imply that digging itself awakens a Wendigo that resides in the ground, but the motivation of the act itself and the consequences from it are very familiar. Like clockwork, each of the stories involving a mine have an incident where they dug too deep, awakening the wrath of a monster. This plotline inevitably represents the greed that these companies and, by extension, the miners themselves were embodying. So again, while the literal act and location aren't super accurate to the Wendigo beliefs, the symbolism is. This conversation about the relevant context was practically gift-wrapped for this script to discuss, and they don't. Warren goes on to say,
They're elusive and known to be eternally starving, but feasting only makes them hungrier and weaker. Those who are unfortunate enough to encounter one can only kill it when it's in its weakened state, and only by extinguishing its beating heart, forcing it to search for another host. But it all makes sense, you see. I mean, our ancestral spirits never died. They were here long before we were, and they'll be here long after we are gone. But now they're angry.
Warren barely mentions cannibalism, but other than that, the actual act itself is only vaguely acknowledged in the movie's events. The accomplice's body is torn in half, but we see it in the morgue, and it's not exactly consumed. The same thing with the principal. While Frank clearly drank some of her blood and potentially some more flesh, her remains are mostly there. In the next scene, the police find the bully's body and specifically say the middle of the corpse had been eaten through. Despite this, the trail of bodies in this movie are a far cry from all of the stories we walked through where the Wendigo eats everything it can from a body. The recorded incidents of Wendigo cannibalism see every part of the body eaten, down to the bones, cracked open for the marrow, or boiled into stew. In this movie, it feels like any cannibalism is more like gruesome window dressing, as opposed to an act that's truly significant. Julia and Paul take Lucas home, and Julia tries to break the news to him that his dad is dead.
My brother Paul, he found him in your house.
That was my old dad, when he was sick and mean. My new dad is with Aiden, but Aiden doesn't understand, and he needs me. I just have to feed him, and he'll love me.
Lucas is very sure that his dad is going to come get him, and they'll all be together again. This turns out to be true, but it's an interesting departure from what we know in general about Wendigos. Usually, they feed on those closest to them first, since their family or companions are immediately available. However, since this movie's traits of its Wendigo doesn't seem to include food scarcity at all, I guess it doesn't really apply to this movie's narrative. A whole lot of action ensues, but in the end, the young brothers and Julia all wind up at the closed mine. Julia finds Lucas and Aiden, but also Frank, consuming a bear mere feet away. As the monster turns to her, we see the ragged remains of Frank's face, still attached to the antlered head. He stands up, towering over her, clawed hands rising to strike, a glowing heart peeking through his ribcage. Julia stabs at the heart, but doesn't make a clean hit. She stabs its throat to no real effect. But it's Lucas who stabs his father's heart through the back of his ribcage. Julia rolls the body over, stabbing and cutting out the Wendigo's burning heart. So I guess we'll talk about that too. They do reference the destruction of the heart being necessary, but they went the opposite of the frozen heart. I'm sure that this was so that we could more easily see the glowing heart in the ribcage, but I feel like we could have suspended our disbelief and let the frozen heart glow if we really wanted to. I will say that I do recall that there was one indigenous story that we heard earlier, where the Wendigo that infiltrated a village was accompanied by the smell of burning. However, as I haven't seen that anywhere else, and we were never really informed where that burning smell came from, I can't say for certain that it's part of Wendigo belief. Aiden begins to screech and scream, his heart beginning to glow in his ribcage. His eyes roll back, seeping black ooze. Julia closes her eyes and picks up the knife. Lucas stops her, telling Julia that Aiden's going to be okay, he's just sick. Julia crouches down and tells him that his brother's never going to get better. They go back and forth until Lucas relents. Julia hugs the shrieking child, driving the knife into his heart through his back, and killing the last thing that Lucas loved in the world. Honestly, this ending made me incredibly sad, which it's supposed to, but it also really irritated me. It completely ignored all of the indigenous belief that a Wendigo can be healed, especially if it's a child who they could guide back into eating appropriate food, encouraging their young mind to forget the horrible incident. As well, we didn't see Aiden consume human flesh. There was a child's body found in the Weaver's attic, but even if he had eaten some of the principal, that transformation into small, horrific antlered beast should have happened right after he ate the human meat. In any case, this version of the Wendigo was treated more like a contagion without a cure, spreading to anything that it touched. Wendigos tend to be turned via the result of famine or from intense isolation, neither of which is true for Frank or Aiden. And also, what happened to the original Wendigo that turned Frank and his accomplice? Maybe I'm missing something, but in general, the ending really disappointed me. I know it's a trope that the main characters only go to see an indigenous person for wisdom and guidance. Afterwards, the story immediately forgets about them. However, I feel like there was a real opportunity for the character Warren to be a part of the process for finding and dealing with the Wendigo. He potentially could have saved Aiden as well. We'll never know. Viewing the movie as a whole, the biggest elephant in the room is that, at least to my knowledge or the knowledge of those I spoke to within the community, there is no Wendigo belief in Oregon. The belief in the Wendigo is firmly around the Great Lakes area and northern Canada. This creature has again been moved to a more convenient area to serve as a narrative boogeyman, with little to no context accompanying it. What's interesting is that in The Quiet Boy by Nick and Tosca, the story actually took place in a tiny fictional town of Rexford, West Virginia. I assume that moving the story up to Oregon was an attempt to get the creature closer to the north, but I don't know why they didn't just make the story in Canada or around the Great Lakes if that was their goal. At the end of the day, I think that this movie's main flaw was that it was trying to do way too much. There are a lot of major issues and conflicts that are touched on in this film, including poverty in old mining towns, addiction, the impacts of addiction on kids, sexual abuse from a parent, physical abuse from a parent, understaffed schools and police in the shadow of child neglect, the lessons from an erasure of indigenous cultures, which they never really address. All of these problems are, in and of themselves, incredibly complex. And by trying to include a little bit of each or dip their toes into the intricacy of all of them, they realize none of them. I don't hate the movie, but as I approach it from the standpoint of representing an indigenous creature that I've researched for months, I don't really think it did a great job. Not the worst job, certainly not. I think it was just too ambitious. But here's the real kicker that surprised the hell out of me. The short story, The Quiet Boy, yeah, there's no Wendigo in it. At all. So they shoved all of these complex issues into one movie, and then wedged the Wendigo in as well for good measure. If you read the short story, it does mention some of the issues I just listed, such as poverty in small-town Appalachia. But most of these things were added unnecessarily to the film. Either way, I recommend reading The Quiet Boy, as it does a great job of building tension and letting us into the single viewpoint and moral conflict of a teacher dealing with horrific events. The story also keeps some horror and mystery, not explaining what the monsters actually are, or how they came to be. So I'll have a link to the story for you all in the show notes and on the podcast website. Let's start our overall conclusion with a quote from DeSanti. Quote, "In the end, pop culture's fascination with the Wendigo may prove a misguided attempt to draw from non-European folklore. I think audiences and filmmakers alike occasionally get tired of the old tried-and-true monsters of the big screen and look outside a Western context for inspiration. More often than not, the filmmakers simply take the Wendigo and make it into a relatable monster for Western audiences, which kind of defeats the purpose of going outside a Western context for inspiration in the first place. I think that there's potential for some really interesting stories and monsters to be developed and told, but we have to take a look at the effect of how we're doing things now. I also think it'd be really beneficial to let Indigenous creators have more opportunities as well. And as I mentioned, I encourage you to enjoy entertainment, but also to consume with your brain turned on. Take a look into the original context of some of these monsters. You'll probably find it interesting. If you can, support Native projects and encourage consulting and championing Native voices that are trying to highlight their own culture. There are so many interesting stories, creatures, and legends out there. It honestly does everyone a favor to include people from all kinds of backgrounds into the cultural landscape. This topic has been a lot, and I'm sure I barely scratched the surface in regards to other tribes that have Wendigo beliefs. It's so interesting to have studied what the Wendigo was for centuries, what it's meant to people in the past, how it's risen in popularity, and that we're potentially repeating the same mistakes that these Wendigo stories warned us about. Consumption of resources was nothing new hundreds of years ago, and now it's worse than it's ever been. We consume resource after resource, and that includes entertainment. YouTube video after TikTok short after movie about a subject that we haven't really slowed down to understand, myself included, until now. And I know we're all busy people with too many responsibilities and what feels like far too little time to enjoy things. But I think maybe we can stand to give a little more time to dig a little deeper into the truth, emotions, and cultures where some of our favorite things came from. This was the last episode of my own research into the Wendigo, but for our next episode, we actually have a guest. Remember Professor Brady DeSanti? Well, I reached out to him and was lucky enough that he had a minute or two to chat with me. So come back next week for an illuminating interview with Mr. DeSanti. See you next week.